The chronicles of France are filled with tales of splendor, triumph, and tragedy. Yet hidden among them is one story so dark that it was whispered only in hushed tones for centuries: the scandalous marriage of Prince Louis de Vaul. At just 17, the young prince stood at the center of a political union that would stain his name and echo through the halls of history. His bride was not a woman of equal standing, nor a lady prepared for the duties of marriage. She was a child bride, far too young to wear the heavy crown of expectation placed upon her. The year was late in the 15th century, a time when kingdoms sought peace not on battlefields but at banquet tables and through arranged marriages. Noble houses treated their children like pawns on a chessboard. Louis, though still more boy than man, was chosen as the piece that would unite two rival dynasties. His bride was brought forth as a symbol of alliance, though her small figure and fearful eyes betrayed the truth. She was too young to understand the weight of the vows that would bind her. The wedding day was dazzling to behold. The cathedral bells rang across the town, banners of crimson and gold fluttered in the cold wind, and nobles from across France arrived in shining carriages. Inside the grand hall, tapestries glowed in the torchlight as priests prepared the sacred rites. To the crowd, it was a spectacle of glory, a moment to prove France's strength and unity. But among the whispers of the guests, unease stirred. Louis appeared pale and solemn, his youth sharpened by the gravity of duty. His bride looked lost within her gown, fabric pooling around her like waves too heavy to bear. Her bouquet of white lilies, flowers of innocence and mourning, trembled in her hands. Chroniclers say she kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her voice barely audible when repeating the vows. Some interpreted her silence as obedience. Others saw it as a sign of terror. The church blessed the union, as was custom. To priests and politicians alike, this was not about love or readiness, but about strategy. The marriage secured land, power, and prestige. Yet for those who watched with more human eyes, the servants, the townsfolk, even some uneasy courtiers, it was a union that felt cursed from the start. As night fell, the castle erupted in celebration. Long tables groaned with roasted boar, spiced pies, and goblets of overflowing wine. Minstrels played lively tunes while noblemen danced with jeweled ladies. Toasts rang out to the health of Louis and his bride, though many noticed her small, clenched hands and tear-streaked face. Tradition demanded the bridal procession. With torches in hand, the court accompanied the young couple to their chamber, priests muttering blessings as the heavy doors closed behind them. Outside, cheers erupted, but inside those walls, something unspeakable occurred. What happened that night became the subject of rumor, scandal, and fearful legend. Servants swore they heard cries piercing through the stone corridors. Guards were said to have rushed into the chamber, only to emerge pale and shaken. By morning, the castle was buzzing with whispers. The wedding night had ended in blood. The details were never recorded with certainty, but all accounts agreed on one truth: the young bride had lashed out. Whether from terror, fury, or sheer desperation, she left the prince scarred and humiliated. Some said she had been driven mad, others that she was possessed, still others that it was divine punishment for forcing children into adult roles. The great feast that had filled the castle with joy now turned to shame and silence. Instead of unity, the marriage sparked division and gossip. Two houses meant to be bound by alliance now stood in scandal, their names forever tied to a bloody wedding night. And so, what began as a grand celebration ended as one of France's most infamous legends. The tale of Prince Louis and the bride too young for marriage, whose wedding night was written not in vows and blessings, but in screams and blood. To understand the scandal of Prince Louis's wedding, one must first understand the world in which it took place. In late medieval France, marriage was rarely about love. It was about power, land, and survival. Alliances were sealed not with ink on parchment but with rings on trembling fingers. Children of noble bloodlines were destined long before they could even speak, their futures traded like pieces on a board. France at the time was fragile. The 100 Years' War with England had ended, but the scars of conflict lingered. Nobles plotted constantly, jockeying for influence, and the throne relied on every tool it could muster to hold the kingdom together. Among the most powerful tools was marriage. Through it, enemies became allies, rivalries were quieted, and families gained legitimacy. A union between two houses was often worth more than 100 soldiers on the battlefield. Louis de Vaul, though only 17, was no exception to this cruel logic. As a prince, his duty was not to his own heart but to France itself. The match was chosen carefully. His bride belonged to a family whose loyalty was uncertain, whose land bordered volatile regions. By binding her to Louis, the crown sought to lock down territory and keep potential rivals under control. The problem was clear to everyone who looked at the girl. She was not ready. Still a child in appearance and spirit, she had been ripped from her family and thrust into a role she could not comprehend. Chroniclers write that she wept during the journey to the royal court, clutching a doll given to her by her nurse. Yet none of this mattered to the lords who arranged the union. To them, her age was irrelevant. She was a symbol, a vessel for alliance. At court, whispers grew before the wedding even began. Some nobles muttered that the match was too hasty, that the bride was not ripened for duty. Others feared it was a curse waiting to happen. Yet no one dared to oppose the king's will. The clergy blessed the arrangement, citing biblical unions and the sanctity of dynastic duty. The people of France, for their part, were divided. Some pitied the girl, calling her a lamb led to slaughter. Others shrugged, for such unions were not rare in their world. Louis himself remains a figure of contradiction in these accounts. At 17, he was old enough to understand what was expected, but still young enough to resent the heavy chains of obligation. Some described him as quiet and melancholic, already hardened by the crown's demands. Others said he showed a flicker of kindness toward his bride, offering her words of comfort as they stood before the altar. But if there was tenderness in him, it was quickly drowned out by the expectations of court. Behind the golden tapestries and jeweled crowns, there was fear. The girl's family had enemies, and some believed the marriage would bring danger rather than safety. Rumors spread of curses, omens, and divine punishment. Superstition thrived in the Middle Ages, and many thought the union was doomed before it began. A falcon released during the ceremony refused to fly, a sign, some said, that the marriage would end in disaster. It is easy now, with the knowledge of history, to see the cracks that were already forming. A boy forced to become a man, a child forced to play the role of a wife, and a court eager to close its eyes to morality in the name of politics. Everything about the union was fragile, waiting only for the slightest spark to collapse into ruin. That spark would come on the wedding night, but even before the blood was spilled, the tragedy had already been written. France had sacrificed 2 young souls at the altar of power, and the kingdom would pay the price in scandal and shame. The wedding of Prince Louis de Vaul was meant to dazzle France. If politics had arranged the match, then spectacle would silence the doubters. The great hall of the royal castle was transformed into a theater of wealth and power. Banners of crimson and gold hung from the stone arches. Chandeliers glowed with hundreds of candles, and the long oak tables bent beneath the weight of food. For one night, the kingdom would forget its troubles and bask in celebration. The guests arrived in waves. Dukes and counts from across France swept into the hall, their cloaks trimmed with fur, their fingers heavy with rings. Ladies shimmered in silks dyed in rare colors, deep blues, fiery scarlets, emerald greens. Minstrels filled the air with lively music, lutes and drums weaving melodies that echoed against the vaulted ceilings. The scent of roasted boar and venison mingled with the sweetness of honeyed wine. Louis sat at the head table, flanked by his new bride. He wore a doublet of deep velvet, his youthful face pale under the weight of the crown's expectations. She, the child bride, looked lost in her gown of ivory and silver, the fabric pooling around her like ocean waves. Though jewels sparkled on her veil, her eyes remained downcast. She pushed the food around her plate, barely touching a morsel. To the assembled nobles, appearances mattered more than truth. They raised goblets in toast after toast, their voices booming with feigned joy. To Louis and his bride, shouted one duke, his words echoed by the crowd. Yet in the quieter corners of the hall, whispers curled like smoke. Too young, muttered a lady-in-waiting. Ill-omened, said another. A courtier crossed himself, recalling the falcon that refused to fly during the ceremony. The feast itself was a marvel of medieval extravagance. Whole pigs roasted with apples in their mouths, pies stuffed with quail and spices from the east, towers of sugared almonds, and great flagons of wine that flowed endlessly. Between courses, performers entertained the crowd. Jugglers with knives, dancers with ribbons, even a dwarf who told scandalous jokes that made the ladies gasp and the men roar with laughter. But even as the hall roared with merriment, the tension lingered, unspoken but palpable. Louis, though barely 17, tried to play the role of a king. He smiled politely, raised his goblet, and spoke when spoken to. But those close enough to see noticed the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched whenever his bride shrank away from him. He looked not like a triumphant groom, but like a boy forced onto a stage he did not choose. The bride herself was the true shadow of the feast. Servants noted how she gripped the edge of the table with small hands, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the floor. Some claimed she whispered prayers under her breath. Others said she barely spoke at all. To the nobles, she was merely part of the alliance, but to those who looked closely, she was a child caught in a storm. As the night wore on, the wine flowed more freely, and the mood grew wilder. Nobles sang bawdy songs, goblets clashed in drunken cheer, and laughter echoed through the stone walls. Yet even in the chaos, the bride sat in silence. It was as though she were carved from stone, a pale statue in the midst of revelry. At midnight, the time came for the final ritual of the night, the bridal procession. Torches were lit, casting flickering light across the hall. Priests stepped forward, their prayers murmured in Latin, while the guests gathered to escort the young couple to their chamber. Tradition demanded this act be public, a spectacle to prove the union had been sealed. But in truth, it was little more than theater. The crowd cheered, some already stumbling with drink, as Louis rose to his feet and offered his hand to his bride. She hesitated, just for a heartbeat, before placing her trembling fingers in his. Together, they walked through the hall, past the watching eyes of nobles and servants alike. Behind them, the music swelled one final time. The chamber doors closed with a heavy thud, and the torches outside guttered in the night air. What awaited within those walls would turn joy to horror. The feast had ended, but the true story of that night was only about to begin. The bridal chamber had been prepared with every luxury the court could offer. Heavy velvet curtains of crimson and gold hung over the windows, shutting out the cold night air. Candles flickered in every corner, their light glimmering against polished brass basins and the carved posts of a great oak bed. The scent of incense lingered in the air, meant to bless the union and drive away ill spirits. But to those who later entered the room, the perfume seemed cloying, suffocating, a mask for the horror that had taken place within. Louis entered first, tall for his age, his shoulders squared in the manner of a prince, but his steps uncertain. He turned to his bride, who followed slowly, her small figure swallowed by the folds of her gown. Servants had laid rose petals across the bed, a symbol of love and fertility, yet they seemed out of place against the solemn silence that filled the chamber. The doors closed with a heavy thud. The guards remained outside, priests finished their blessings, and the court returned to its feasting. What happened next was hidden from their eyes, but not from their ears. The first sound was a cry, sharp, piercing, filled with terror. It echoed down the corridor, freezing the guards in place. Then came shouting, hurried footsteps, the clatter of something striking the floor. Within moments, the cries grew louder, more desperate, until the entire wing of the castle seemed to tremble. When the guards finally forced the doors open, they found chaos. The once pristine chamber was overturned, the bedclothes torn, candles toppled, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. Louis stood clutching the side of his face, blood staining the velvet of his doublet. His bride crouched nearby, her hair loose, her small hands trembling, eyes wide with fury and fear. The details remain obscured in legend. Some say she lashed out in madness, driven beyond reason by terror. Others whisper she struck deliberately, with the ferocity of someone who refused to be caged. The truth is blurred by time, but one thing was certain. The groom's ear had been savaged, leaving him scarred both in body and in pride. Servants rushed to the prince, pressing cloths to the wound, while others tried to calm the girl, who cried out incoherent words, her voice breaking with every sob. The chamber filled with whispers, gasps, and the rustle of scandal. No one dared speak openly, yet all understood. This was no ordinary quarrel, no private mishap. This was a disaster. The blood stained not just the prince's garment, but the honor of two great houses. What had been promised as a sacred alliance now stood on the brink of collapse. To the nobles, it was a humiliation beyond measure. To the clergy, it was a violation of divine order. To the servants, it was a nightmare they would whisper about for the rest of their lives. Word spread through the castle before dawn. Some claimed the bride had been possessed by spirits, her violence the work of demons sent to punish the marriage. Others said it was divine justice, proof that forcing children into adult roles was a sin. Still others believed it was a calculated act of rebellion, a desperate attempt by a powerless girl to defy the chains placed upon her. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. The wedding that was meant to unite France had become its greatest scandal. The prince was left wounded, humiliated before his court. The young bride was forever branded as wild, cursed, or worse. And the kingdom, instead of celebrating unity, awoke to the taste of shame and blood. The chamber doors were sealed again, but the whispers could not be silenced. From that night forward, the story of the bloody wedding spread beyond the castle walls, carried by merchants, minstrels, and gossipers. France had witnessed many tragedies, but never one so intimate, so shocking, so unforgettable. And thus, the legend of the bloody wedding night was born. By dawn, the castle that had echoed with music and laughter only hours before was drowning in whispers. Servants rushed through the corridors with pale faces, nobles gathered in tight circles, and priests muttered hurried prayers as though to cleanse the halls of sin. The story spread before the sun had fully risen. The wedding of Prince Louis de Vaul had ended not in blessing, but in blood. Louis himself remained in his chamber, attended by physicians who pressed bandages against his wound. His ear, though not entirely lost, was savagely torn. The young prince sat in silence, his pride wounded more deeply than his flesh. Witnesses swore that his eyes, usually solemn and distant, now burned with humiliation and fury. The scar would remain with him forever, a reminder of that cursed night. The bride, meanwhile, was confined to her quarters, guarded as though she were both prisoner and monster. Some claimed she wept endlessly, her cries echoing through the stone corridors. Others whispered that she had fallen into silence, her gaze fixed on nothing, her mind broken by what she had endured. No one knew the truth, for she was kept away from the eyes of the court. At first, the nobles tried to keep the scandal contained. Messengers were warned, servants threatened into silence, and the official word was that the wedding had been delayed by illness. But secrets in a medieval court never stayed buried. The whispers slipped through the cracks of the castle like smoke. By midday, merchants in the marketplace repeated tales of a cursed bride. By evening, priests in distant chapels muttered warnings of divine punishment. The court itself was divided. Some nobles argued that the girl was unfit for marriage, that her family had shamed the crown by offering her. Others insisted Louis had been cursed, targeted by envious enemies or vengeful spirits. The most superstitious claimed to see omens in every corner: the falcon that refused to fly at the ceremony, the candle that sputtered out as the vows were spoken, even a sudden storm that struck the castle roofs during the feast. The church faced its own crisis. A marriage blessed at the altar had ended in violence, and that raised dangerous questions. Was it a test from God, a punishment for pride, or proof that the sacred order had been broken by forcing children into roles they were not meant to bear? Some priests whispered that the union should be annulled. Others, fearing the wrath of the king, preached silence and obedience. For the common people, the scandal was a gift of gossip. Minstrels quickly turned the tale into song, painting Louis as a tragic prince and his bride as a cursed maiden. In taverns, drunken men reenacted the bloody night, laughing as they clutched their ears. Mothers warned their daughters of the dangers of forced marriages, while others simply shook their heads and said, "The nobles reap what they sow." But beneath the laughter and rumors lay something darker. France itself felt the sting of shame. What was meant to be a display of unity and strength had become a spectacle of weakness and humiliation. Rival kingdoms across Europe whispered of the scandal, mocking the French court. Ambassadors sent hurried reports to their kings, telling of a bride who attacked her groom and a prince left scarred before his people. The damage was not just to Louis's pride or his bride's reputation, but to the very foundation of the alliance. The two houses that had been bound together now stood at odds. Accusations flew, one side blaming the girl's family for sending a mad child, the other accusing the crown of cruelty and neglect. What had begun as a union to secure peace now threatened to ignite new feuds. The king himself, though not recorded in detail, is said to have raged in private. His son, his legacy, humiliated on the most important night of his life. His court mocked, his enemies emboldened, his kingdom ridiculed. Yet even he could not undo the past. The bloody wedding night was no longer just an incident. It was a legend, spreading like wildfire, impossible to silence. And so, by the end of that cursed day, the fate of Prince Louis and his bride was sealed not by vows, but by scandal. What should have been the foundation of a dynasty had instead become a scar on France's history. A story told and retold, each time darker, each time more damning. In the weeks that followed, the bloody wedding of Prince Louis became more than a scandal. It became a curse whispered through the halls of France, a story too powerful to be silenced, too shameful to be forgotten. The young bride remained cloistered, hidden away in her chambers, spoken of only in guarded tones. Some said she had fallen ill from grief and fear. Others claimed she was possessed, her mind shattered by forces beyond human comprehension. Whatever the truth, she was erased from public life, a ghost living within castle walls. Louis, on the other hand, bore his wound like an unwanted crown. Though healers stitched his torn flesh, the scar remained, a twisted reminder carved into his body for all to see. To courtiers, it became a symbol of weakness. To rivals, it was mockery. To Louis himself, it was torment. He carried not only the scar of his ear but the deeper wound of humiliation, one that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Beyond the castle gates, the people of France shaped the story into something larger than life. Minstrels sang ballads of a cursed wedding, of a bride too young and a groom too proud. In one version, the girl was portrayed as a victim, a lamb forced to the altar, whose desperate act was one of defiance against a cruel fate. In another, she became a demon, sent to punish the royal family for its arrogance. Every telling twisted the truth further, until no one knew where history ended and legend began. The church tried to stamp out the tale, declaring it sinful gossip, but their efforts only fueled curiosity. Priests thundered from pulpits that the marriage was holy, that the events of that night were misinterpreted, yet the whispers spread faster than sermons could silence them. For the common folk, it was not just scandal, it was a parable, a warning of what happens when power outweighs humanity, when innocence is sacrificed to ambition. In the courts of Europe, rival kingdoms laughed. Ambassadors carried tales of France's humiliation to England, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Foreign rulers mocked the young prince who had been bested by his own bride. Diplomats whispered that France was cursed, its royal bloodline tainted by shame. And so the marriage that had been meant to unite two noble houses instead divided an entire realm. The alliance shattered, the families embittered, the people disillusioned. What had begun as a political maneuver ended as a moral disaster, and France would never forget. Over time, the details blurred, but the legend remained. Centuries later, chroniclers still wrote of the bloody wedding night of Prince Louis, each retelling darker than the last. Some painted him as a tragic figure, others as a fool. The bride was sometimes remembered as a victim, sometimes as a monster. But in every version, the truth was the same. That night ended not in unity, but in screams and blood. And perhaps that is why the tale survived. Because it was more than a scandal. It was a mirror, showing the cruelty of a system that treated children as pawns, marriages as weapons, and lives as bargaining chips. The story of Louis and his bride endured not for its gore, but for its meaning. Even today, the legend whispers through history, reminding us of the price of ambition, the dangers of pride, and the curse of power without compassion. The bloody wedding night was not just the downfall of a prince. It was the birth of a cautionary tale, etched forever into the memory of France.